Hey everyone, welcome to the Newcomers Podcast, where I explore what it means to be an immigrant, like myself. In this episode, I'm talking to Shamira Madhany. She's the managing director of WES. WES is World Education Services, the folks who help us. When you're moving to Canada, they literally validate your credentials. They say, oh yeah, you have the skill set to come into Canada. But then we get here and we go through underemployment, or we're undervalued, or we get all the things that happen, that we have the conversation of this immigrant good, that immigrant bad. And so with Shamira, I'm talking about how can we have a better immigrant conversation? And what are the things that she's seeing or she's doing with West to help move the conversation to a better place? Enjoy. Folks, today I have with me no, let me tell you a story. Let me not say her name, but let me tell you a story. Every single time you want to come to Canada, you send your credentials to a non-for-profit and they validate if your skill set works. And I have with me today the managing director of WES, Shamira Madhany. Thank you so much for doing this. Honestly, thank you for doing this with me today.
And I feel so honored, Dozy. Honestly, when you invited me to attend this conversation, um, we're World Education Services, as you said, we assess academic credentials for almost 200 different countries. But why I wanted to have the conversation with you is to make it real in
Yeah,
terms of what it really means to open doors when we assess credentials. And people's lives and aspirations when they get their credentials assessed, and then once they get here, then what does a life journey look like? So I'm very excited about
me too.
sharing my journey and Wes's journey with you.
Me too. And I will get right into it. I think while we had during our pre-call, you talked about. I found that really interesting how you talked a bit about your dad. And I want to explore that with you, like how your journey, watching your dad's journey and how that has influenced, all you've done, public service, West, you know.
Sure. So my journey is very much the journey of many immigrants. And unfortunately, it continues. And what I want to do is my life's mission, actually, Dozy, is to open doors, but open doors in a way to make systemic changes so that you don't have family after family coming and then having their dreams and aspirations dashed. So let me talk to you about my own personal journey and why I've made it my life's mission to open doors. So I came as a young child with my younger sister with my parents in the early 70s. It was during the time when Idi Amin, who was the president of Uganda in East Africa, basically expelled 200,000 Ugandan Asians. Those who were born there and with nothing on their backs, and they left. We lived in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya, and my dad at that point realized that there was a possibility that we would be next, and he wanted to make sure that he had a better life for his two girls. And so we came to Canada as an independent immigrant with the full expectation, because we basically studied in a British school system. My dad did. He was a business entrepreneur. He had restaurants, and the whole idea was you come into Canada as an independent immigrant, express entry these days, and you come and hit the ground running. Just get a job. I'll open up businesses or whatever it takes to succeed. And I watched what happened, Dozy. It basically, there was a role reversal that took place. He put many, many applications in. He wouldn't get any callbacks. He would then go personally, and people didn't even want to understand what his education background was. We would go around looking for apartments. The apartments were available. We would go there, and then as soon as the door opens, it's like, oh, the apartment is gone. And so, as I watched that as a young child, it was really hard. And it wasn't just happening to my dad, Dozy. It was happening to, our community members. And I watched everybody, and I realized what my dad did was, as time went on, He took a job at a local golf club, just basically picking up towels, washing toilets, because that was the only way that he knew that he could survive without, the funding he brought that would disappear. My mom, who's 4 foot nothing, like 90 pounds, ended up working at Magna in a factory picking up metal. And it was hard to watch what was happening to her and families. And he literally decided to sacrifice what he had come for so that my sister and I could succeed. The story of many families.
Yeah.
But what I did, because I was in high school, is I wanted to make sure that when I went to university, that I actually would try and make a difference so this wouldn't happen to other individuals. And then fast forward, I ended up not-for-profit organization. I ended up in the Ontario government. I was very fortunate to have amazing mentors and ministers who basically just understood what needed to be done and opened many doors even while within government. My last job was in cabinet office, and I was very fortunate again to work with many ministries doing social policy and always basically putting forth the idea of highly skilled immigrants who are coming to our country or coming to our province who are not contributing. So fast forward to World Education Services. Um, about 6 years ago, an executive search firm phoned me and said there is an opportunity at West and would you be interested? And I thought, oh, okay, that's really interesting. Nobody actually ever leaves government, and I was in a pretty senior position. But the reason why I decided to come is because I felt that this was yet another opportunity
Yeah.
on the outside to basically, push the systemic changes. I had many opportunities in government and it worked. But from the outside, it does make a difference because I wanted to be on the ground with the individuals, with an organization that was doing the kind of work that was powerful. And I thought, leading the organization in Canada would help me open up the doors even wider, understanding what their issues were. So that's my journey.
It's a beautiful one. I mean, this all the thing about your dad and your mom, and that's the reality. A lot of people. I mean, and so I'm sorry. That's those stories always hit me in a very interesting way. Because I think why it hits me that bad is how we people come here with dreams, and you hear people say to them, "You sacrifice your dreams for your child," that's fair. Like, I mean, that in a
Josie,
way,
I'm not sure. I'm not actually sure that's fair. In fact, that's
no,
what I
no.
want to prevent.
Oh, yeah, I hear that. I mean, so what I mean is that from an emotional point of view, it sounds like a
Correct.
good thing to do.
Correct.
It sounds very good, for very noble. It sounds good and all that. But when you start to peel all those layers back, what you find is someone who wonders what would have been.
You absolutely, Josie. So that's why the fairness comes into, you brought me to this country to contribute my skills. I got the points to come in to contribute to this wonderful country that has given us so many opportunities in different ways. And then when you take away, what you brought me for, and I will take any job because I am going to succeed
Oh
in a
yeah,
different way, my children. It's not fair. And, it goes back to what could have been, what would have been my life. So, I sacrifice my children will be successful. But, what I'm hoping to do is I don't want, the second generation to succeed. I want the first generation coming in
yeah.
to succeed with the systemic changes that governments should actually put in place.
Gosh, I you had this Times Hill Times piece that you wrote, just penned. That was actually where I reached out when I saw it,
Right.
which is where you talk about how this is still happening. Like, we still undervalue immigrants. Like, we still. I don't want to say the Canadian experience one, like, because I feel like people have fought about it, but it just feels like it's still there in a way. And it reminds me of something Daniel Ben had said when we talked, which is Daniel Ben had the CEO of ICC, where he
Yes.
said we need to stay. The IRCC is actually Canada's HR department, and we need to start thinking of it that way, because if you think about it, it's actually criminal that you bring people in and then we undervalue them. Like, so I want to explore that more with you and just talk a bit about that and what we are losing as a country when we do
Sure.
that.
So the Hill Times was very much about where I was starting to see a narrative that was talking about how many people should we bring in, the levels and mix, how many people should leave because they are here on a temporary basis. And it was all about numbers. And then when the polling started taking place, the way you ask the questions, you get the answers.
Yeah.
And it's, do we need more immigration, less immigration? Are immigrants basically creating a housing crisis? And so the reason why I needed to put that piece in the Hill Times is really the conversation has to be a very different conversation, Doxy. The reality is that 100% of our workforce is going to comprise of immigrants. It's already starting to get there in the next 3 to 5 years. And the reason for that is because we have an aging population. We are going to have more people in their 80s in the next 5 years than any other time in history of Canada.
Damn.
We used to have birth rates. It was about 2.3 per family. It is now 1.2, even if you're an immigrant family. And the reason is because it's more expensive to
Yeah.
basically come here and have children. So when you have a situation where you have an aging population and that's the workforce that's retiring and then running into health issues, which is natural, and you don't have enough young people coming into the system, you then automatically have labor shortages. And that's the reason why we need immigrants to basically fill the labor shortages. The however is that if we just think about numbers and we don't understand that what we're doing is we are bringing highly skilled people and then we do not recognize the skills and education and then they end up doing just any job like my dad did, then the country loses
Yes.
because it is about the long-term sustainability of Canada. So when we talk about productivity, GDP, etc., it also comes from the fact is who is in the workforce. Are they getting living wages? Are they in positions commensurate with their experience? Are these full-time jobs where they can contribute not only in the workplace but also in society?
Yeah.
Or is this about I'm doing 2 or 3 jobs at minimum wage just to make ends meet? Of course, my productivity isn't going to be that great,
Yeah.
and I'm not going to be able to contribute to GDP because I'm not paying in taxes that are due. So for me, that Hill Times was the conversation. The narrative has to change from how many immigrants should I bring in, how many should we basically push out once the temporary work permits expire, to as a country what do we need to do to make sure that we continue to remain competitive in the short, mid, and long term? And as a result, what does the talent look like? And if we are bringing talent, which we are, 60% of the people we bring in are highly skilled. Are we leveraging their skills to be able to grow our economy, basically increase productivity, increase GDP? That conversation is not happening
At
because
all.
we're talking in silos. It's about immigrants are basically taking away rather than actually looking at what immigrants have given, the number of immigrants who set up businesses. My dad did eventually. He did end up setting up a
Beautiful.
small business. Immigrants are basically as scientists who are contributing to science, vaccines. Immigrants who basically in the health sector who are going into nursing and associated professions. So those are the stories that need to be told, not the
Yeah.
stories of those who are taking away from the country.
And uh, I told you about the episode that just went live with David Moscrop, and we talked about one thing he did mention, which I found really interesting, was how a lot of these things are just perceived, and some of it is real scarcity issues, but it's just perceived we have in our heads about our need to survive. And so when we need to survive, it's like who's the easiest scapegoat to hold for fiscal irresponsibility, wrong policy calls. Like we could go down, it's a whole gamut of things that we could talk about, but I don't want to do that here. And we do that. But I think the bigger thing there is you called it out. You called the number. It was $22 billion in GDP that we lose because we don't properly integrate. And I would even dare say, someone said to me, like we lose, like three things happen when an immigrant comes. There's a first loss, which is the country they come from loses talent. That's the first loss.
Correct.
The second loss is that when we don't integrate them properly, Canada loses talent. That's the second loss. The third loss is basically the immigrant themselves lose themselves because you're not operating your full potential. You feel out of place. You feel like you're a useless person. You start to doubt yourself. And like when the lady put it for me that way, just Wumi of Immigrant Techies, when she put it that way, like it's unconscionable. Like, why are we doing that? Like, why? Because like that's a three-layered loss of potential, identity, talent. I'm like, gosh, like this is actually a very horrible, horrible, horrible thing that we're doing. And we need to find a way to get out of it because it doesn't make sense.
So I'll give you some numbers. It's from RBC that I have in front of me, and this is sort of at the macro level. So this is RBC Economics estimates that Canada forgoes 50 billion in GDP, 50 in GDP due to the immigrant wage gap. So I'll just repeat that for effect. RBC Economics estimates that Canada forgoes 50 billion in GDP due to the immigrant wage gap. I'll continue. It is estimated that Canadian businesses lose $38 billion a year due to workforce shortages. And you ask yourself, what's wrong with the picture? If individuals are here and you're saying that we have workforce shortages, so you now basically have a situation here where we know that, a bank has done studies to show what the country is losing. And then on the other side, when Canadian businesses said that they're losing $38 billion a year because of shortages, you ask yourself the question, what's wrong with this picture? And I'll tell you what's wrong with the picture. So let me give you a few more stats because I'm a total data geek. And so today, the unemployment rate for immigrants is about 9.1%, the unemployment rate. I'm not talking about underemployment.
Yeah.
For Canadians, it's about 6.2%. For immigrant youth who are racialized or refugees, it's almost 20%. Now, I want you to think about those numbers. And why do you have so many immigrants when, in fact, in the last 2 years, if you look at what Stats Canada has put out, and if you look at our population growth, we went from 40 to 41, it was all immigrants.
Yeah.
So, as I'm putting these numbers in front of you, ask yourself, what's wrong with this picture? We lose if we don't leverage the skills.
Mm-hmm.
We have labor shortages, but immigrants are unemployed or underemployed. So to me, the biggest issue here is that you have a situation where when immigrants are coming in, West does a fantastic job. We've been around for 50 years. We'll be celebrating 25 years here in Canada, where we assess the academic qualifications based on, our country's education standards. It's when they go to the next stage. They usually use a resume. So they will do the academic assessment and put that as part of here's, where I am and the Canadian standards. And then they will do up a resume that's either chronological or functional to try and demonstrate the deep experience they have. And therein lies the problem because employers don't know how to translate that. And
Yeah.
so they will make assumptions and they will either underhire or won't hire. And so this immigrant continues to struggle the way my dad did because he might have had entrepreneurial experience. So what the issue is in my mind as I've been thinking about what are the changes that are required, one is that at the micro level we need to make sure that there are standardized consistent tools to assess somebody's prior experience. And right now that doesn't necessarily exist in a consistent and standardized way. Now, I know that technology companies are doing this. I know that IBM is doing that for their own staff. But I think that, we could be leaders in this country.
Yep.
We could take some employers who would say, I'm willing to do it, instead of using AI and just, doing word searches. If they really don't want to have or lose the $38 billion a year, we need to look at competency assessment, because what you have out there, and you've heard this, Dozy, is lack of credential assessments.
Yeah.
Well, actually, credential assessments has two components. It's the academic assessments. We're doing that. It's the competency or the skills or the experience assessment. And we could look at what that looks like and actually assess the credentials from an experience perspective, from a competency perspective. And so to me, that's basically what's missing. And that's the work that needs to happen.
And I agree. I agree because I feel like we focus so much on the translating. Like, what school did you go to? Oh, what certifications have you done? Which is why if you talk among immigrants, it just feels like we're on a certification craze. Every immigrant wants to get 10 certifications in project management or whatever field you're in. But really, what we are really looking for is I'm looking for a way to validate my skill set. That's actually what we are looking for.
Correct. But I just want to correct one thing, is that you do need that foundational education
Yes. Oh, yes.
assessment.
Yes.
So building on that, absolutely, you're right. The next step is, the validation of an immigrant's experience, the deep experience. And, to me, it's potentially, and I'm going to say this, but I'm not in IT, or, I don't do competency assessment, but it's almost like three layers. When somebody graduates from university or college and they go into the workplace, the employer knows immediately they've got the academic qualifications, but they don't have experience. It's an entry level job. So the expectations of that individual look like this. Then if you look at, somebody who is middle management, then they have a bit more experience under their belt, and here's what the expectations are. And somebody who's then got deep experience, diversity of organizations, we know where they fit. They could go into the executive level, etc. So if HR professionals already know that, the same thing could happen with immigrants, because what we do with immigrants, highly skilled, is we act and treat them like as though they just graduated from school.
Oh,
And so we
yeah.
will look at their academic assessments, and then we discount any kind of experience. And that's where you now have the missing puzzle. Because as long as I
Yeah.
don't understand your experience, I don't know how to translate it, and I'm not willing to take the risk. Because, if I take a risk, it hits my bottom line. And what I would say to employers, if they're listening to this program, is in fact, you are losing,
Yeah.
because you end up not getting a person who has deep experience, who's going to be very loyal to you, who basically will contribute to your organization and to the country, because they will pay taxes that are commensurate with their experience. They will be part of society. They will bring like a different kind of environment in the community they live in. It just opens up doors and it changes people's lives instead of struggling and struggling and struggling. So, this is where those, in terms of the initial conversation that we had, and you said, but what can we do about it? And again, I put it in the Hill Times, is very much around everybody is working in their silos. And we all talk about the problem statements. But what we haven't done as a country is, come together and have a conversation. I understand the complexity of jurisdictional issues. Again, was a bureaucrat. I understand that. But instead of saying, well, it's the provincial issue, or it's a licensing board issue, or, it's this or that, we need to have a conversation with all levels of government sitting together to say, what are we trying to do as a country? And what does that mean? And then if there are pieces of legislation that are creating barriers, what can we do to reduce that? So, a really concrete example of what has happened recently with the tariffs conversation,
Yeah.
the 25%. Isn't it a miracle that all of a sudden we're going to have a conversation on how you reduce trade barriers amongst provinces?
Oh
And you
yeah.
have a minister saying, I could do this in 30 days.
Oh
That's a
yeah.
miracle, right? And you're thinking, okay, if you could
That's
do that,
good.
then, then let's create even bigger miracles around bringing, people who are coming here, because we know the top 5 or 6 source countries. And why can't we just think about what that looks like? And in fact, this is the time to do it. If we are talking about, Canada and, Canada strong, then this is the opportunity
Yeah.
where, as a Canadian, I came here as a young child. I'm Canadian first. I want to make sure that we succeed. And so, let's do that with the immigrants who are coming who are never sure, am I part of this country or society? Am I not? And they want to belong. And they want to be able to stand up straight and sing the national anthem. They're just exhausted and doing 5 or 6 jobs and never getting the chance to succeed.
It's I'm laughing, but it's a every single time you said that 5 or 6 jobs, because I know a couple of people who have done that, and you just like like it's depressing. I think one thing that I don't fully understand, or I think about a lot, is how do we better connect these macro policy conversations with all the micro realities of the immigrant experience, especially when you start to break it up into the employer and the community, because I feel like those two parts play a huge role in solving some of these things we talk about: community belonging and finding your way, getting a job. But then also there's also the macro, which is like what's happening in policy, what's the government driving, what are we doing as a government, how are we making sure that cascades all the way down to these bigger blocks that are literally drive the micro conversation.
So it's totally possible if we think very practically in terms of how to do this. At the macro level, so what you need is at the basically at the federal level, the different ministries responsible for the different files to come together, coordinated by, and probably in the Prime Minister's office. So IRCC, ESDC, Health Canada, with the number of health professionals that we are bringing in, Heritage Canada, they need to have a conversation together as to how we work together. Because right now, what ends up happening is that each ministry has a counterpart committee. ESDC has a form of labor market ministers. The immigration IRCC has a different table where they basically negotiate with each province. Health Canada is a health table where it comes together as a Council of Federation, chaired by the Prime Minister. And the immigration conversation never takes place there because there are other ministries doing it. So that's the first step, is at least at the federal level, have a conversation, coordinate, your mandate agreements and the work that you're doing. And then basically concurrently, the provinces have to do the same. And so those are at the government levels. From a community perspective, Dozy, the federal government puts in $1.1 billion for settlement services across the country. $1.1 billion. Now, that might be reduced with the number of
Yeah.
immigrants who will come. So we have umbrella organizations across the country of settlement agencies. I'm not even sure whether employers know about that. There's the OCASI, which is the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, as an example. There's one in BC, one in Atlantic provinces. They also meet federally. These are the agencies that serve immigrants directly. That's a conversation that could happen in terms of, tell us what's happening. And I don't mean just IRCC and not just about funding, but what is your experience as people are coming to your doors? So that's settlement agencies. The other is that when you look at immigrants themselves, because they basically go to different places, workforce development places, they go to churches, there's a way to get like the actual experience of focus groups. I'll tell you a little bit about what Wes is doing, because we are trying to basically do grassroots level work. So we have a program called hashtag Employers Works program, where what we have done is we are going into different provinces and into communities, and literally working with the employers, the local post-secondary institutions, the settlement agencies to understand, what are the issues that immigrants and highly skilled and others face, and how can employers come together with basically individuals and post-secondary institutions to pave the way forward. And I'm happy to share that information
You should
later, or look
please.
on our website. But we're doing that in different provinces. We're in New Brunswick. There is a Winnipeg um, uh, website where they talk about that. So that's already happening. Then there's another area where we have a significant number of refugees, some who are highly skilled, some who, because of fragmented education and civil war, might not have had an opportunity to actually go to school on a regular basis. What we have is a refugee roundtable. It comprises employers and agencies. It is currently chaired by Senator Andrew Cardozo. Prior to that, it was chaired by Senator Ratna Omidwar, who just retired. It was her brainchild. And what this roundtable does is brings employers from across the country together to talk about what can we do to open doors for refugees, because they basically struggle through multiple complex barriers. And so how can we open up doors and give basically um, an opportunity for these refugees to work. So we have had something that I believe is a powerful model, Dozy. What that is, it's called a refugee hiring event. It's not a job fair. It's a refugee hiring event. So what we do with this hiring event is basically we go from city to city where they are asking for us to play a role. We'll partner with um, a local immigration agency or the city. And what we will basically do is invite refugees to come to this hiring event. But they have to meet certain criteria. They have to be job ready, English
Mhm.
proficiency skills. But once they meet that first criteria, they will work with a local settlement agency and that local settlement agency acts like an executive search firm. So they will
Hmm.
get them ready to go
I like
in
that.
for an interview. So once that's done, they come to the refugee hiring event day. They basically come in for an interview. We have employers who are already there waiting for them. The last event that we had in Toronto, we had almost 40 or 50 employers. The individual comes in, they get registered, then they get a little bit of coaching and moral support while they're waiting for the employer to call them in. As soon as they're ready, the employer will interview them. It's a formal interview process, Dozy. Literally, they would be at the workplace. And there are three things that happen after that interview, because that individual leaves and they will have a document with them. There's somebody who's waiting out there, and there are three outcomes. You got a job.
Yeah.
And you can imagine that has changed a life. It's a refugee who
Yeah.
might be on social assistance. The second will be you did really well. The second interview now, because this job is quite complex, will be at the workplace. The third outcome will be, I'm sorry you didn't make it. You need some more support. That individual is referred back to that agency person who's sitting there to give the moral support because they're devastated. And literally that's what happens. And while we're there, you have LinkedIn there. They're basically taking their LinkedIn pictures and helping them to write up their LinkedIn profile. But Dozy, what we're actually doing is giving people jobs and changing lives. It's called the Refugee Hiring Event, and we go basically province to province, and it's highly successful. And this is a model that we want to replicate across the country. It's not a job fair; it's a hiring event. They get jobs.
This is so good. Because I have a theory, or I have a hypothesis that one of the fastest ways to help immigrants get on the journey of feeling like they belong is to get them hired.
Correct.
That's the fastest way for people. That's when people start the journey towards integration and feeling like they belong. But as long as they feel like they're struggling to survive, they're not sure where tomorrow is going to come, the money for tomorrow is going to come from, all that stuff. they'll always feel like the other. And, you know, it's a thing. I think for me, the thing I really want to explore, so and building on that, because that's a really, I think what's humbling about that is how much people don't know or we don't know about what's going on and all the help and all the policies that are happening. But I think also the other thing, which is it's almost insidious in a way, is that a lot of the narrative out there is almost always around the funding and a very simplistic things. It's you just feel like, oh yeah, we're spending 4 billion on this. No one talks about the outcomes. No one talks about where it fails. No one talks about where it could get better. And maybe that's something worth exploring. Is like, how do we? What is working? What is working and what hasn't worked? And how do we tell the story of what has worked and show that we're trying to make it better? Because I feel like it kind of leads to my next question, which is like, how do we go beyond the very simplistic immigrant good, immigrant bad? Because it's so nuanced. It's like this thing you say now about like the refugee process, which is like the 3 step. First level, you got a job. You're more confident. I mean, even if you don't get a job, you're more confident at the end of that thing. Yes, you need moral support, but you come out of that, you have a LinkedIn profile. You can talk more to your next interview. You can explain your story better because you know what you just did. You just got trained and coached, and you practiced in a live session. But it feels like all those things just get caught up in the very simplistic. Oh, that immigrant good, this immigrant bad. I'm like, God, no, not again.
Yeah, it's kind of it's something that I've been grappling with. And you asked me a question around how do you go macro, micro, and for 2025, notwithstanding, leadership changes at the federal level, an election in Ontario, what's happening in the US, our priority is going to be, this is at World Education Services, is changing the narrative because we get caught up in the negative narrative or get caught up in the narrative of how much money we're spending, when in the meantime, it's about real lives and real people who
Yes.
are struggling. And so the couple of things that we are looking at is one is to basically think about polling that is going to ask the right questions because you
Mm,
can't do policy by polling because polling is always a limited sample and you ask them certain questions, you'll get an answer, you do your analysis. But if you're not asking the right questions, then you end up with a response that you then use to say, X percentage of Canadians said that we should bring in fewer immigrants. And then yet when you ask a different question is, do you think that immigrants benefit the society or Canada? And you'll have the same number saying, and immigrants benefit Canada. Okay, what's wrong with this picture? If they benefit Canada, then, should we bring less or more? Or, do we have labor shortages? So as a first thing that we are in the process of doing is we are going to do some polling to actually ask the right questions. Do you know how many immigrants have actually set up businesses? That may give you some numbers. Did you know that? Or do you know how many are in the science or the IT field? So one is polling, and the polling needs to stop from polling for and then making policy or using that to, basically think about the political platforms to real questions around what are Canadians thinking. So that's one piece. The second is that, we talk about macro level policy, and then you have the major media outlets and then social media. The other strategy that we want to have is to work within communities because communities are small and they actually appreciate the value, the benefits of,
mm,
immigrants in their community.
mm.
They're living there, they're shopping there, they might be working there. And so, how can you work within local communities who understand because they're not caught up in the politics of who, what, where, why.
Yeah.
They just want to make sure that, their community is safe, that the individuals or neighbors who are going to contribute to, whatever it is. So, that's the second piece. The third is that the policies that have been coming out have generally come from top down. And, we don't believe that enough voices have been heard in terms of what is the future of immigration in Canada. Because right now, again, what has happened is that we used to have a consistent, standardized immigration system for express entry, but we have had to put in a lot of other policies. So it started stacking up. So now there is no clarity around what is the future of immigration and what's the
Yeah.
vision. What are we trying to accomplish? Is it about labor shortages? Is it about, growing a country that has a diversity of voices, that can be entrepreneurial, that can have global connections? Those things have been lost with what has happened in the last year. And so what we are in the process of doing is we're going to run a series of virtual roundtables with a diverse group of different stakeholders, licensing bodies, employers, settlement agencies, immigrants themselves, think tanks, and ask them some big questions. What does the future look like? What do you think are the barriers? What could we do on a go forward basis? And we then hope to put out a paper or a series of papers depending on what we find, because what we want to do is change the narrative out there and change the conversations so that Canadians are having a conversation, not responding to what's being put out there, and then
Yes.
the social media that then picks it up, and then everybody has their own perspectives. It's like, let's just move forward in a big macro level conversation. There is a group called Coalition for a Business for a Better Future.
Okay.
Coalition for a Better Future, and it's co-chaired by Lisa Raitt and Anne McLennan, and that's what they talk about in their document. What the long-term economic sustainability is, and where does Canada want to be, and where should we be situated. There are the think tanks like Century Initiative, and they've put some papers out. So there are groups that are trying to put papers out. What we want to be able to do is hear voices and use those voices to put the papers out, to build on what's taking place out there.
How so, all of that, like, I'm always thinking, like, how do we find the balance between turning the conversation into a very technical economic unit conversation, versus, keeping the humanity in it. Like, I understand, like, yes, there's the value of the immigrant themselves, but, like, at some point, there's a way we can take the conversation and the value becomes very utilitarian. Like, okay, how do we use them? Like, it starts to sound that way.
Sure.
And how do we keep that balance? Because, like, it always befuddles me, because I'm like, every single thing you've mentioned right now is an important thing to talk about. You can just say, oh, I want to get the immigrant in. Like, you have to plan it. But it is at the same time, I believe there should be some humanity. And it's so easy. I mean, especially the last year. Last year was scary for me, because if I just watched the conversation go so easily to a very dehumanizing conversation, very easily, without any people I respect too, like, just said stuff. And I'm like, oh, that's an interesting point of view.
Because it has to be a balanced approach, right? Because you basically have a situation. Sorry, I'm just saying. You have to have a situation where, you know, as a country, and to remain economically sustainable, and we talk about productivity, GDP, you got to have those numbers.
Yeah.
You got to have the numbers. I gave you the $50 billion loss, and you balance that with, these are real people who basically are resilient. They have sacrificed everything. They have left good lives behind. These are not people who just came, where they weren't doing well and they came here and thought they would do better. These were people, senior levels in their home countries. They're basically, coming here to do something similar and to contribute. And so what happens to them in terms of, as you said, the loss of self-confidence, the lack of ability to contribute in a meaningful way, and then they don't pay taxes. or
Yeah.
at least they're not able to pay the proper taxes. So, in my mind, it has to be a really balanced approach. And you've got to talk about the impact on the economy and the loss to the economy. And on the other side, the human in the middle, the
Yes.
impact on the human and the aspirations. I mean, you can talk to any Uber driver and they all have stories to tell. They all have stories to tell around what they came for and why they're driving Ubers. And I wish that people, Canadians, would put themselves into the shoes of these immigrants, even for 3 minutes, to be empathetic around what's happening. Because if there was a civil war in Canada and they went to another country that had opened doors, and if they had to go through the same feelings, how would they feel? Like, even if
Yes.
they spent 3 minutes a day thinking about the impact on people who are highly skilled. If they just took some time talking to the people as they're in Uber, as they're going to coffee shops and understanding their stories. There are doctors who are basically working as personal support workers. There are highly trained nurses who worked in the front lines of war zones who are basically, washing toilets in a home care facility. Is that the kind of society we want? So, if people understood from a human perspective. So, really what I'm saying is that we've got to do the balanced approach of head, because you need the numbers and the economics as a country for long-term sustainability, but you also got to do it with heart. We've been a good country so far. We are a humane country. We've brought in refugees. We've always been open. When you think about what happened with the Syrian crisis, we opened doors. We opened doors during the Afghani crisis because, as Canadians, we're good people generally. But that story gets lost when all of a sudden it's like, oh, the housing is so expensive. It's those immigrants who did it. In the meantime, it was nothing to do with immigrants. It was all with a view to
Gosh.
regulations, etc., etc., etc. So it's just interesting conversations. And my hope is that what we can also do in local communities and local libraries, that people have these really important conversations rather than just the top down. And I would hope that, Dozy, with the work that you're doing, how do you push this information out so these kinds of conversations that you and I are having isn't just here? Because
Yeah.
otherwise you either have sound bites and it becomes retail politics, or the people who are really basically being impacted don't have a voice.
Yeah.
And how do you have, an idea that I've always thought about is something called the concept of the human library. And I don't know whether you ever heard of that, but we have libraries in our
That is
communities.
brilliant.
And instead of a book club, you have a human library. What you
Yes.
do is you invite an immigrant who's going to talk to you about the journey and what has happened, and people come and listen, and then it becomes a ripple effect, because that's where you get
Gosh.
this, the stories told of what happened to my parents, what happened, etc. So it's just, I was talking to somebody recently because they also got a hold of me after I had the Hill Times, and these are two professors at McMaster University, McGill, I can't remember, but they said to me, "Do you know how many immigrants won the Nobel Peace Prize?" And I said, no. And they said that, they've done research and the analysis. And these are people who came in as immigrants who are now winning the Nobel Peace Prize. Look at the Vector Institute. But he said, we don't count that. That is discounted because it's all about, immigrants taking away. But they're contributing. They said to me, do you know, during the COVID times, there were scientists who were immigrants who were trying to develop a vaccine. Nobody talks about that, right? And you think about some of the businesses that have been set up and the type of businesses that are supporting individuals who did that. They were basically immigrants, but those stories are not being told. And
Yeah.
what's the mechanism to do that?
This is why I think for me, this is why everyone should care because, in the end, it affects us all. Like,
It does.
we simplify it into this versus that. But the downstream effects of everything we do affects us all. We all complain. We all go to the hospital and we don't have doctors. We all complain about traffic. We all complain that houses are expensive. We complain about everything because in the end, The issues don't know you're an immigrant or you're not an immigrant. The issues just simply know it's an issue and I'm going to hit you hard, you know. But that
So there
concept of
is
the
one thing that I can imagine your listeners are going to do almost immediately in terms of, when you said when I go to um, the hospital and there's a labor shortage, and so I can imagine one many of your listeners would say, yeah, but they don't actually meet our standards, and why would I want somebody? So I want
oh,
to address that, because that's a really important thing that I made sure, working with licensing bodies, we call them gatekeepers. They're not all gatekeepers. What licensing bodies need to do, because there are liability issues, they have to
yeah.
balance the highest standards that we have in Canada and we expect, but they have to balance that with fairness and equity. And what that means concretely, Dozy, is just because you happen to come from a particular country, you don't discount that education and assume that it's lower. Many times it might be even higher than the
Oh
Canadian
yes.
standards.
Yes.
So when we talk about licensing, I am not saying just accept everybody and get them licensed and into the workforce. What I'm saying to licensing bodies is that basically make sure that when people are putting in their applications, that you give them a timely response so they're not waiting and waiting and waiting, that you don't make them duplicate what they already did, like English tests. And three is that you, in a bona fide way, look at their competencies so that it's in a fair and transparent way. And that's the balance, because they've got to do their job. They've got to make sure that people who get licensed, meet the highest standards, balanced with fairness, equity, and transparency. So people know really quickly where they stand. Because if they wait and wait and wait, they lose their relevancy, they lose experience, and then they have to start again. So that's just something that gets really important in terms of what we're trying to do.
And thanks for calling that out actually, because I totally agree. Eh, gosh, I think even the scary part is what you just said now, how so we say we hold them up, say, oh, we need to license them. It takes a long time. And then we finally license them. But what we've done is we've literally damaged stuff along the way because they're less confident. Their skills in the law of retraining to get them back up to speed, which costs the country money. And
And
no
it
one is
costs that
talking.
individual because, in fact, they will
Yes.
never get licensed. Some of the license requirements dictates that you have to have recency of experience.
Ah,
And if you don't have recency of experience, you basically end up losing. So that becomes really important. And I want to make one more plug as I'm looking at the time. That's really, I have to do this. Um, when individuals basically come to the country and initially they have to start the licensing process, it's expensive. It basically probably costs them. It costs them, depending on the profession, up to sometimes $200,000, and they really can't afford it. It really depends on the profession. So I am on the board of a not-for-profit organization called Windmill Microlending.
well,
And
yeah, I know
Windmill
them.
basically provides low interest loans to individuals to basically, start or finish the licensing process, change their careers, or actually do PD opportunities. Great organization. I love it with a passion. They change lives. The repayment rate is 97%. The interest rate is lower than what the banks provide, and they don't just give a check. They work with the individuals on financial literacy, coaching, mentoring. And what has happened, because we were just at a meeting yesterday, is for those who basically end up in the health profession, their salary level goes up 3.7 times. Just saying, 3.7 times. They are contributing commensurate with the experience. Think about that. So I just wanted to make a plug for Windmill.
Yeah, I'm actually chatting with one of them about something together. But yeah, I really like their work, and just kind of
Thanks,
bridging that
guys.
gap between finding the cash you need to get over some of the things. I think the last question I have for you is.
Yeah, you notice that they're starting to write to me. It's like, guys, stop. Somebody must have come out of a meeting. So
I
sorry
think
about
last
that.
question I have for you is Sorry about that. Um, Looking ahead, do you have hope?
I do. I actually do, Dozy. I mean, I know that everybody's despairing a lot in terms of, what's happening around us, but I totally have hope. And the reason why I have hope is because for me, people are actually talking about immigration.
Yeah,
That could have been buried. So the fact that we're talking about immigration, the fact that, all of us, if not many of us, are immigrants already. And I feel like as though this whole situation, which is what has happened with the tariffs, is bringing us together in solidarity. That gives me hope. And I've always had hope that we can actually move to the next stage. It's a matter of the how conversations. I'm hoping that, as politicians are going through their elections and whatever else, that they basically see the bigger picture in terms of the country versus, individual platform commitments or the party. I'm hoping that, we go, but I have a lot of hope. From the time that I've been doing this work, which has been a very long time from when I watched my dad do what I've seen. Although, we started the conversation by saying, but how many years later and we're still having the same conversation? I actually did a chart that showed how much progress we have made. There used to
right.
be a point in time around the Human Rights Commission where you basically couldn't think about the whole Canadian experience question. And there's guidance around, where and how you can ask Canadian experience. Professional Engineers Ontario removed the concept of asking for the 1 year Canadian experience, etc., legislation. So there is a lot of work that
Yeah,
has been done. We just need to move faster. And now there are no barriers because you could use technology to do
yes,
virtual technology assessments. There are opportunities, and we should just leverage those opportunities to move forward. Because as a country, our future depends on immigrants.
thank you. Honestly, thank you. And thanks for all the work you do with Wes and your team. Like, thank you. Because sometimes I do this. Sometimes because I do this and I have these conversations, I'm very highly attuned to what's going on. And sometimes you just feel so tired
I know.
because you're just like, I mean, last year was a very interesting one. I like someone said, it felt like we were an open mic session with immigration policy. Like, oh yeah, we're gonna do this. Oh no, we're gonna do that now. I'm like, and
What I'm going to leave you with, and hopefully it doesn't get disturbed. So here's what I'm going to leave you with. If you think about yourself as a butterfly, and a butterfly goes from flower to flower pollinating, and if you think about that, then it becomes, powerful in terms of your ability in the work that you're doing. And that's what I see myself doing. Because the reality is that working at West, I mean, it's a huge honor to be working for an organization that is having such a significant impact. But what I see myself doing is really, the paying it forward, the ripple effect, the butterfly that's going to pollinate so that others pick it up and can move it forward. And that's why I don't despair, because if I can speak to people like you and others, then, take it away and do something with it. And the other analogy that I think I've given you when we talked before is I don't want to give out umbrellas anymore, Dozy. I want to change the climate because giving out umbrellas is too tiring and it's too expensive. But if you
yeah,
change the climate, you can change people's lives and change the trajectory of our country.
thank you so much.
Welcome.
It felt good to be called a butterfly for the first time. But thank you so much for listening to this. I hope this was helpful because it was very, very helpful for me. If you know someone who should get on this, please share with them. Someone who should talk to, send them my way. Again, as always, please like, share, subscribe. We're on Substack, we're on YouTube. We're on anywhere you find your podcast.